Hi everyone, it's Charmaine Hammond. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are live on the follow-up call from the amazing conference in St. Louis. Oh wow, it was so wonderful to meet you all, and I want to do a shout out to the organizers of the Midwest ACE event. Kudos to all of you. I know what it takes to put on an event, and that event was stellar. I met some of the most incredible people, had wonderful conversations, and the event just flowed. So thank you for all the hard work that you did as a committee to pull together such a fabulous learning opportunity for everyone. I walked away with so much new information and a much deeper understanding of the role that all of you play in career services and really helping build a promising future for students. So thank you. Let's rock and roll. We've got some of you that are already on live, and of course we're going to record this so that if you need to listen to it again or want to share it in your team, you're welcome to do that. And the other piece is that there's people that couldn't join us live today but really wanted to get the recording. So you will get a follow-up email with the recording link. Feel free to share it, and there is a chat box, and you should all be hearing my voice now. So if you cannot hear my voice, let me know in the chat box, and if you've got questions, you can type your questions in the chat box. It's on the right hand side of your screen, and I'll get to those questions right away. And if there's any that come in close to our time ending together, I'll send you out an email with the answers to those questions. Often when I'm explaining different concepts, I mention different resources, and if there's resources I mention, I'll type them in the chat box and send them to all of you. So let's get rocking and rolling here. We wanted to talk about managing change and expanding your field of vision, and I wanted to provide some additional information from what I covered in my time with all of you at the event, and some new perspectives. So when we were together, we talked about managing change and all of the different elements of keeping people engaged in managing change. And then for some of you, we talked about expanding your field of vision. You were participating in the follow-up session that I did, the breakout session. And I'm going to share a few insights that came out of that workshop, because I think all of you that were in the big forum with me will want to hear this as well. So when we're managing change, there are so many moving parts. Have you found that when there's a change in the organization, and it could be a small change, it doesn't have to be something ginormous. It could be a very small change, but it really sends people into a state of frustration or chaos or confusion. And there's some things that I can offer you today that I think will really help you remove some of the bumps that happen in change management. And it's my experience over the last couple of years, things are changing at warp speed. Getting used to the concept that change is going to happen is part of it, that mindset that we have. You'll remember I talked about the fact that our minds are processing 60,000 thoughts a day. Do you remember that from the presentation? And I was laughing, saying that's probably why we go home tired. But really the research is showing that we process about 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are negative, or some will be neutral, but most of them are negative thoughts or self-defeating type thoughts. And when those kind of mindsets get in the way in change management, what we will find is that it is harder and harder to get people engaged. So in the chat box today, I'd love for you to share if there is something that you have done in your particular organization that has worked really well for you in change. Alternatively, if you've had a real bumpy change management process that you've been involved in the past, and there are some things that you'll never do again, the things to avoid, please also type those in the chat box. So let's talk about some elements for managing change. One of those is that we have to communicate. And there's a couple of strategies I'd like to share with you around how to communicate effectively during change management. So here's what happens when a change goes down. Not everybody was there to read the corporate memo. So you have people on holidays or people on mat leave who are coming back in the middle of a process. And what we know, and what the research tells us, is that when people don't have the information they need, they make assumptions. You'll probably remember that from the presentation I gave, that we make assumptions actually all the time. But in change, when people's level of uncertainty is higher and when their fear factor is going up, there is a much higher degree of assumptions that are being made. And where this causes us challenge as an organization and as a team, and where this definitely challenges leaders, is that when people make an assumption and it's wrong, and then they act on it, there's a whole other mess to clean up. So with assumptions, there's a couple of ways that you can reduce the number of assumptions that are going to have, and even inspire people to more quickly check out the assumptions. One of those strategies is what I refer to as cascading messages. So cascading messages, you probably all do this all the time. You may not have a title for it, but I'm pretty certain you guys are well aware of what cascading messages are. This is where you communicate something in a variety of different ways over a period of time so that people do get the memo. They do get the message. An example would be one company that I was working with. They hired me to come in and do some training. They were a municipal government, and they had tremendous change going on. Some of the changes they were facing were organizational, what would you call it, restructuring. So there was restructuring going on. There was organizational teams that were amalgamating. There was a few teams actually that became non-existent. They just basically divested the staff into other areas of the organization, and then the actual department was gone. So there was that kind of change, but they also had a lot of policy changes coming out, big policy changes that affected how people work together. They also had changes in the geographic boundaries that they were going to be serving. So they were putting priority on other local nearby communities. And of course, this then impacted the types of clients they served. There was also changes in their collective agreements that they had negotiated, and the list goes on. So you can imagine an organization, all kinds of changes going on, and the team was full of rumors. When I went into the one particular team, what I was dealing with for the first day in training was really eliminating rumors. There were so many rumors, and the rumors were created, and we found this out through a conversation with them. The rumors were created because people simply didn't have accurate information. When people don't have accurate information, they assume or they make it up. They make up the end of the story. And then that's the story that gets shared and shared. And of course, every time it's shared, it changes a bit more. With a cascading message, with this particular team, the leader of the team actually shared what's going to be changing with everybody there. Now, there were some people missing. There was vacation and mat leaves going on. So he took the presentation of what was going to be changing and also did that in an email. What I thought was really cool and really personal is because the staff that was on mat leave was going to be returning within, I think, about 2 months, so it was coming up fairly quickly. He actually phoned the staff and said, we have staff and there's some critical information I want you to know. And this was really helpful because that stopped some of the rumor gossips from happening outside of work. Now, the next thing he did is he followed up that presentation, that meeting, with a real quick email to the team, summarizing what he presented on. At the next staff meeting, which was about 2 weeks following that, he did a recap, which was interesting because people that weren't at the other staff meeting were at this one, so they got to hear it again. And then he also met with people individually, just a real quick little touch base kind of a session, and just checked in with them to see what questions they have, if there was anything that wasn't clear. I became aware that this strategy was so powerful in how his team versus other teams in the organization coped with the change. Now, one of the suggestions that I gave him is that he focused a lot on what was going to be changing. And for a lot of people, when we hear this is going to change and this will be different and you're no longer going to do things this way, it creates fear in people. And some people are really good at dealing with change. Other people, it's scary and overwhelming. And so for that group, the more he talked about what was changing, the higher their fear went. And you'll remember we talked about Dr. Sean DeParron in my presentation when she said, when knowledge goes up, fear goes down. And so I provided him the suggestion of what he may also want to do is talk about what's not going to be changing. So he took that advice, and he, at a future staff meeting, he explained to everybody, here's what is going to be changing, but here's what's not changing. And the list was far longer on all the things that were going to be the same. Now, here's how I created that strategy. Funny story. In a very earlier career, I was a mediator. You might remember that from the presentation, from the keynote. I was a mediator, and I was working not only in corporate situations, but also in family situations. And I was mediating divorces and separations. And one of the pieces of advice that I often offer to the parents who their children were struggling to cope is I would say, let your kids know what's not changing. Let them know what's going to be the same. It helps them cope. And that same strategy worked many, many years later for a team of professionals. Let them know what's not changing and communicate in cascading messages. The other thing that we want to do when we're managing change is keep our ear open, keep your ear to the ground to listen for gossip and rumors and misinterpretations of information. And that, clarify it right away. I remember years ago, I worked for a nonprofit organization. This was long before I opened my business. And I was new on the job. I think I'd been there about 3 months at this staff meeting that gave me nightmares for months after. There was a lot that was going to be changing. And of course, because I was the new director there, the change was sort of being blamed on me. So it was not a comfortable conversation. And I noticed that there was all kinds of rumors. I was sort of hearing bits and pieces of them. You know what it's like. You only hear bits and pieces and you don't get the whole story. But I actually thought I need to address this, and I was quite nervous about doing that. And at a staff meeting, an all group meeting, it was a pretty small organization, 12 people. But I just put the rumors on the table. Here's what I'm hearing. Here's some of the stories I've heard bits and pieces of. Let's talk as a team about accurate information. And when I was able to not focus on the rumors as much as focus on what was accurate and really open the door for them to ask questions without any fear or without any judgment or blame, this furthered the conversation. I got a lot less resistance, but it was pretty tense for a few weeks afterwards because people were still in reaction mode. But I kept reinforcing the same accurate information over and over and over again. And eventually, that was the story that they told each other. So when they were bantering back and forth and comparing notes, which people do in a team, what they were doing was comparing notes on accurate information. So those were a couple of really important tips. I'm just looking at my notes to see if I've forgotten anything. This is really important, what I'm going to share now. It's the concept of giving people a role in change. Part of what happens in change processes is that people's role in the organization starts to become confusing. And let's maybe talk about a scenario. When I was working on a contract with Children's Services, a government organization, I used to do a lot of training and facilitation for that particular department. And they were having some service changes going on. So the new Minister of Social Services had come out with a new directive. I'm sure you see that in education and in career services where there's new political changes that are going to direct how service happens. And the changes were actually really exciting for this government department. They felt that children and families were going to be served so much better. And what was the challenge, though, was where did they fit into that? So prior to this announcement, they knew where they fit into the organization. They knew their role. But after the announcement, it was really confusing for people to figure out where they fit in. And part of what the manager had to do was actually spend time letting people know where they fit in and where their role was contributing to the bigger picture. And that's really what we want to do here, is help people be reassured that their role, their day-to-day work activities are actually supporting the bigger picture, or they're actually supporting the change that's happening. So let me just check into the chat box here. I'm going to see if we have any questions. I do have questions that came in ahead of time. So let me check into the chat box here, and we'll see if there's any questions coming up, and I will grab my notes. All right. Here's one of the questions that came up prior to the webinar from someone who couldn't be here today. And the question was, what do you do when you have someone who's really resistant to the change? Really had lots of L's and Y's and exclamation marks. So I kind of interpreted that to be, you've got an individual that is actually getting in the way of change, is resisting it, probably talking negatively about the change, probably trying to get people to buy into his or her perception of how awful the change is going to be, and might even be a bit combative about the change in staff meetings or conversations. So that was the kind of reference that I drew from the really with all the L's and the Y's and the exclamation marks. Here's a couple of thoughts that I can offer about resistance, because it will happen no matter how much you communicate, no matter how exceptionally skilled you are at cascading communication, no matter how much you address the rumors and the gossip, there will be people that resist the change. And part of that is that's their coping style. If you were to look at them closely, you would probably find that this particular individual resists other things than just change. They might resist feedback from colleagues or supervisors. They might even resist good opportunities that come their way. So that's probably a pattern of coping that that individual has. One of the things that we can do when people are resistant is to answer one question. And that question is why. Now, if you ask them why are you resisting, probably just setting yourself up for an emotionally charged conversation. So I wouldn't ask it that way. But the questions that you're asking are intended to get at that one question, the question of why. Some ways that you could frame that could be, I noticed that when you talk about the change, you talk about it in a way that doesn't feel like you're committed to it. Help me understand what's going on for you. So that was a way of addressing the resistant without calling the behavior. Because if we say to them, I feel like you're being really resistant, it's a judgment. And you and I both know that when we feel judged, people push back. They simply do. And they turn off listening and they turn off engagement. So you can ask the questions in a series of ways. I have kind of a 3 approach to questions I want to share with you. One, I'm trying to find people's underlying drivers or underlying interests, a concern or resistance is one example of that. I use 3 questions. So I ask the first question, like the one I just gave you, and then I ask another question. So I listen to what they've said. So let's just role play this out for a minute. Let's say I've asked that question and the person says, well, you know what, we've gone through so much change and this is just the flavor of the month and I'm just tired of having a change and we get going in a certain way and then here we are, another change. So if I'm listening for what's important to him, what I'm hearing is follow through and consistency and the speed of change. So I might paraphrase something like, wow, it sounds like change is happening really fast, or there's been a lot of it for you. And he might be nodding his head now because he's been affirmed. And I might also add to something like, it sounds like what's important to you is that when change is started, is that it really be completed and followed up on. And he may say, yeah, that's totally it. And then I would ask that second question. Why is that important to you? How does that help you when that change follow through or commitment happens? And then he would answer, and then I would ask a third question. So you're using this dynamic skill, which you use every single day in your work. I know you do, of that listening, paraphrasing back, but you're paraphrasing not just to show that you've heard them. You're paraphrasing to show that you understand what is valuable to them, what is important to them. That's what you're actually capturing in the paraphrase. That kind of dialogue can really break through resistance quickly. The other piece that you can do is actually change gears. It's sort of a reverse thinking in a sense. So you could say, you know, I'm hearing that this particular change is really frustrating to you. Can you give me an example? And I actually wouldn't say can you, because they could say no. Give me an example of a change that you went through, and it doesn't even matter if it was here at our organization. Give me an example of a change that you went through that felt like it worked well. What was happening in that change process that made it feel like it was working well? And what you're getting from that kind of a question, again, is what's important to them. When you understand what's important to them and driving their resistance or their fear, that you can deal with. Now, we got another question here on the chat box. Thanks, Kristen. It says, what advice would you have regarding responding to change that happens without prior communication or planning? Oh, those are tough, aren't they? And they happen a lot in corporations. They actually happen a lot in the entrepreneur world as well, these changes that just seem to come out of nowhere, and they really take people by surprise. And let me know on the chat box if you have a strategy as well that you've dealt with, because I imagine a lot of you have dealt with these changes that there's been no prior communication or planning, or what often happens is there's been a lot of prior communication and planning, but it's been with a certain segment of the organization. So for example, it might have been with the HR and the leaders, or it might have been with a particular team, and it's now going to affect the rest of the organization. A couple things that we can do, again, is when that change is going to be rolled out, really important to think about the communication, because there's going to be questions that come up. And if you can think about what people's questions will be, and what their objections will be, you can prepare for it. This is where, when people don't prepare for it, they feel like they're sort of being blasted, or even, I've heard the word, attacked. So when the change has happened on a different level, or the change is being presented to you and you haven't been involved in the conversations or the planning, first of all, we want to anticipate what questions people are going to have when we share that. What objections are they going to have? And what will our response be to that? So for example, if someone says, well, why weren't we part of it? That happens, right? Why weren't we a part of that? Change is affecting us and we didn't have our voice. That's a question or an objection that you would want to have an answer to. And I always suggest an honest, authentic answer. And sometimes what happens in organizations is change is messy. Remember, we talked about that in the conference. Change is messy and lots of things get missed. I see it all the time. And I was actually at a consultation type meeting with a client of mine. He worked in a communications department in a government office. And this is exactly kind of the scenario you're describing, Kristen. There had been some change planning that had gone on at a much higher level. And then basically this leader's job was to now present the change to the team. And there wasn't going to be an opportunity for input or anything. It was sort of, here's the change that we're now all going to be doing. So I remember the conversation, he was ahead of time before he talked to his team, feeling nervous about it, because on one side, he really wants to support his leaders. And on the other side, he really wants to support the people that he leads. And the change question, why weren't we involved, did come up. And he was really authentic about that. He just said, the change happened at a different level and I wasn't provided with the opportunity for input, and either were any of us. And I've actually provided that feedback to the team to let them know that this could have been an opportunity for us to perhaps influence a decision or have some input. The reality is, it is where it is. And so as a team, let's figure out how we're going to get through this together. So we didn't glom onto, we weren't included, we missed the opportunity. He addressed it. He addressed it and what he had done about it. And it was really interesting to watch. Nobody sort of seemed bothered by that as much. And what he did say is that as we go through this together, I'd like you all as our team to now provide me with feedback. So when things are feeling clunky in this process, if you're coming up with issues that are problematic or things that are working really well with this new change that we're implementing, please provide that to me, because I'd like to go back to the original committee and share that feedback with them on our behalf. And so what he did, I thought, was really skillful. He addressed the issue. He provided reassurance that there was another way that people could still provide change, input, or I guess influence into the change. And that seemed to work really well for that group. Now back to Kristen's question here about change that happens without prior communication or planning. There's another side of this. Sometimes what we have is what we call reactive change, or putting out fires change. So something happens in an organization or in a community that businesses have to respond to or react to. Or a change happens in the organization as a way of addressing a crisis. So I want you all to imagine, I don't think we did this exercise at the conference, but if you are with somebody in your office later, you can do this. So what you do in an exercise is one of you puts your hands up like this or sort of sideways, and then you get your colleague to put their hand like this on your hand. So you're not arm wrestling or anything like that. You just have your hand and their hand like this. And then what I want you to do is one of you would be person A. So let's say this hand is person A, this person is B. You're going to have person A push on person B's hand as hard as they can. And person B is going to do what comes natural to them. Can anyone guess what the reaction is? Somebody is pushing as hard as they can on your hand for real. What do you think the reaction is? Let's hear from a few of you. If someone's pushing your hand really hard like that, what's typically the reaction of, let's say, 85% of the people? This will be the skill testing question of the day. And I'll just watch the chat box for your answers. And there's a method in my madness for sharing this. You got it, Patricia. And Cindy, thank you. Push back. Exactly. What we do in life is that when we feel pushed, so in this example, it was a real push. When we feel pushed, 85% of us push back. So Craig, yeah, let go of the hand. Very few people do that. The large majority of people, when they're being pushed, their reaction is not to take their hand away. They're a reaction in that exact second. I'm not talking about 10 seconds after when they process it and think it through. In that exact second, they push back. And that's called reaction. We've all done it. You know, I'm going to take the example of 14-year-old girls. Does anyone here have a 14-year-old girl? I'm using daughters because daughters tend to do this more than sons. But here's what 14-year-old daughters often do. If their parent says something that they don't agree with or don't like, you know, you can't go to that party, or you're too young to do that, or you take off some of that makeup, or whatever the feedback is. A natural reaction for 14-year-old girls looks something like this. Whatever. So there's the eyeball roll and the cheeky comment, as my mom would call it. That's called a reaction. Now, given 10 seconds to process that dynamic, their reaction may have been different. But in that very split second where we don't think things through, we react in a certain way by saying something, being a certain way, or doing something. That happens all the time in change. So people react, they push back. And what we can do in change processes is take away that pushback scenario by giving people the information they need, feeding it to them in a pace that is manageable. So sort of talking in sound bites. Also talking in stories can help people. I know a lot of you do this in the work that you do. You talk sort of in stories or in examples. That can be really helpful. So the key here is we want to change these reactions into responses. Now back to the question that Kristen had, a lot of time when change happens, it's because we're reacting to something that happened. So a problem occurred and we've got to solve it right away, instead of putting in the time and energy to really think it through. So unless it's a life or death or a safety situation, or your organization's reputation be called under the question so quickly, most times it isn't one of those. And you could take the time to have the conversations and plan it. One group that I worked with, I can't even remember the industry they were in. I'm just trying to think. It may have been nursing. In the healthcare industry. They did something really interesting, and actually probably high risk, really, but it worked out so well for them. They were going through some significant rollouts of changes. It was sort of like one change after another, and they were getting lots of pushback, lots and lots of pushback from all different levels. It was healthcare. I just remembered because I remember there was the head of physician involved, and they were not getting support from the influencers in that organization. What they did is they put together a change committee. Now, they didn't call it that because change in that organization was frowned upon. It was not a word that people got excited about. And they were called ambassadors or champions. I don't remember which, but it was one of the two. And this committee actually was largely comprised of people who were pushing back. people who were reacting, people who were resisting. And they became the strongest ambassadors of the change, and why their role was so critical. And it was a very well facilitated, laid out process, but why their role was so critical is they were living all the reasons why they wouldn't buy into the change and all the reasons they were going to resist it. But they were part of a team to help this become a smoother transition for everyone. It really transformed these people. And because they had been resistors or reactors and pushing back, when they were able to come back to their own colleagues in their specific departments and communicate change and this different perspective, people really believe that. They saw the transition that happened with their colleague. So again, I said that's high risk. It could have gone the opposite way. It could have been, could have been a disaster, but it worked out really well for them. So if you're going to do something like that, make sure you planned that. So Kristen, I hope that answers your question. I'd love to hear if Jason says I was in a rolling chair and moved. I probably should have put a safety precaution on that. Plant your feet to the ground firmly and hold on. So I hope that answered your question, Christian. Anyone who has dealt with that particular situation, feel free to type it in the chat box. I'm going to go through a couple more tips that are really helpful with change. And I don't know if you remember in the keynote, I talked about the example of William Bridges, who is an author I love, and he talks about change and transition. And he always says that change begins with an ending. This was key. When I learned that, it completely changed how I dealt with change in my own life, but also how I facilitated change processes with my corporate clients. As a consultant and speaker, I go in all the time and work with different organizations and teams to help them with their change processes. So when I read the book twice and understood William Bridges' perspective, it shifted how I even thought about how we deal with change, because he says change begins with an ending, which means that people are grieving something before they accept the new change. Now, it might be a small change, a policy change where there really isn't grief, but there's still a change. So let me share with you my first big, well, I don't know if it's an epic failure, but it's pretty close. My very first job as a leader. So I was probably far too young to be an executive director of an organization. And I was new at the job, and it was actually a women's shelter. Really interesting learning opportunity for me. It had not been an area of social services that I had worked in before. So it was a massive learning curve for me, and a big learning curve for me as a leader. And I was trying to improve some of the efficiencies that were there, and also there had been an increase in government reporting. I'm sure some of you have to deal with government reporting. So the government had at that time changed their the forms. We were still on forms. We were not on computers then. So we were on forms, and they used to be sort of a triplicate type form, and we'd send 2 copies off to the 2 different departments, and then they went to a single form that was then just faxed to them. And the form that the organization had been using had been photocopied so many times. When I started my job there, I could not read the form. Now, they all knew what the form said. They'd been filling it out forever. It was the same form that was on the triplicate, but that now that they were going to the single form version, few differences, but pretty much all the same questions. But nobody told me that it was the same form, and I could have gone and looked at an old one. So when I'm trying to look at this form that's been photocopied 9,000 times from a really crummy original, I couldn't read the questions. And so I came in thinking I was going to be the bearer of a new solution for this team and make their life easy. So I showed up the next day. I had my office manager retype the form. And I want to say she had great resistance to this. She kept telling me, "You're doing the wrong thing. You're doing the wrong thing." And I kept asking her, "What do you mean? Why?" And she said, "You'll see." That was all I got. So I was feeling a little, it was awkward. So I had no idea what to anticipate, and she knew something and she wouldn't share it. And I tried several times to get her to share this, and she kept saying, "This is not going to go over well." Now let me share with you the internal thinking. So the internal thinking for me was, for Pete's sakes, it's just a form. It's a piece of paper. Why could changing a piece of paper be so traumatic for people? So I show up the next day in a staff meeting with my nice form. It's all been retyped. I can read it. They can read it. And what I got was a whole bunch of people sitting like this at the table, not even looking at me. They broke eye contact. And I felt extremely unprepared at that moment. And I didn't know what was going on. So sometimes when you don't know what's going on, here's the tip. You just simply need to be authentic in the moment and ask. So I simply said, I have no idea what's going on here, people. Can you enlighten me? Please help me. I know something has changed here in the energy in the room, and I know there's some problems with this new form that I've just presented, and I honestly don't get it. Please help me. So one of the ladies who had been there since the organization opened, she was a historian. She was part of so much change and growth in the organization. She said, Charmaine, I was part of the team that put that form together. It was like 30 years before I put that form together. And she said, you know, it was originally on a typewriter. Now that started to make sense why the form looked so awful. It wasn't even on a computer and a printer. It had been typed on a typewriter, and they just kept photocopying it and photocopying it. So all of a sudden I started to get it. Wow, this form, actually it's not about a piece of paper. It's about sentiment in the organization. That me producing this new form was ending something. And it was actually symbolic for them. It was the first thing they had done. It was their first form. It was what brought the group together. So here I thought it was just a form. It was way bigger to them. Here's what we did. So first of all, I thanked them profusely for letting me understand that. And I actually put the form aside and said, so we need to figure out how we're going to get, so that we can read the form, we need a new form. We have to send it to the government. It's got to look good. We need a new form. And they agreed to take that on, and it would be just like what was on the triplicate form and look great and serve us well. But what we did is we had a bit of a ceremony for the form. The original form that had been copied so many times was framed, and it hung in the boardroom with a little note about, you know, celebrating from the beginning. And so I learned a lot that day that sometimes what's going on in a change process is the symbolic meaning of something. And for them, there was symbolism with that form. So you really want to start to think about change in a different way. Just like Brit just says, change begins with an ending. You have to look at what's ending so that you can help people welcome the beginning. Just like he said, change is like Linus when his his blanket is in the dryer. Now, a couple of other things that we can do is we want to do review and learns. A review and learn are 4 questions, and I went over these in the keynote, and I want to talk about them again because they're so critical. Anytime you implement a change, it could be a small change or a significant change rollout. Please get a group of people, and I would suggest the more diverse the review and learn team, the better feedback you're going to get. It's also really helpful to have somebody facilitate this. I do a lot of that with my clients. I go actually in and facilitate a review and learn for them. I've got 2 going on next week with nonprofits that I'm working with that just finished events, and we're going to do a review and learn. And it's going to be actually a short meeting. It's not a half day. It's not a big brainstorming session. I keep them really focused. And there's 4 questions that you answer. The first one is what went well. And the reason you start there is because you really want people thinking about what went well. You know, where were some of the wins in this change process? Often there's hidden surprises, something that people thought was not going to go over very well, and it was actually a piece of cake. So we want to track that. So you need someone facilitating it. In your organization, it might be one of the internal trainers. It might be staff from another team or a leader from another team. It could be somebody from HR, but you really want to have somebody facilitate it to help keep the meeting on track, because when you ask the next question, what was a challenge? People can start bringing in all kinds of stories to the answer. And we don't want to have the stories as much as we want to have the bullet points. So what worked well? And people will list off what worked well. Write them down. That's the other role. You want to have somebody scribing. And you can actually pull out these notes every time you go through a change. What went well? What was a challenge? There is a bit of a tendency at this question for people to blame or for people to push back. It might be helpful, and I often do this, is to actually set a context for people when you're starting, or certainly when you're starting this question. Just say, you know, this is not about blame. It's not about pointing fingers, because you've heard the story. For every finger pointing at you, there's every finger that you're pointing, there's 3 more pointing back at you. So you can make light of it, but really set some context. And it's not about blame or judgment or finger pointing. It's really about finding helpful information to assess how this change management process worked. And if you can talk in point form versus the whole story, because you don't need the whole backstory. What you really want is, what were the challenges? And you'll often hear people, one of the challenges that I've heard in every single review and learn I've ever done is communication. They always bring that up. So then you get to the question of, what will we do differently? So you can actually go back to the list. If you're tracking it and you said, okay guys, one of the challenges that you identified was communication. What could we now do differently? Because they will be in the idea mode. They'll be in solution thinking mode. And you can track those ideas. We're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. And then you've got that information for your next change, regardless of the size or the impact of the change. You've got that information. And then the last question is, what did we learn? I actually like to break that question up. What did we learn about our team, our organization, the change? And then what did we learn about ourselves? And that's a very insightful question. At one review and learn that I did with a big company, it was pretty much all males in that company. Maybe 10% of the staff were females with the group I worked with, but they were all males. And it was so insightful to hear their reaction or their question and their answers around, what did I learn about myself? And I'll never forget, one gentleman said, you know, I've dealt with lots of change in my life, personally and professionally. And he said, these are his words, I'll never forget. He says, I suck at change. And he had a perception, he had created a mindset that he can handle it, piece of cake, change, no problem. And he learned by having to answer this question that he wasn't really as skilled at change as he thought. And he went on to say, and I think I get in the way. And his team all looked at him. It was kind of funny because his team all looked at him with this sort of look, you think? So I'm laughing because I just went back there in my head. So they're sort of looking at, you think? No, really? They all knew that he didn't like change, that he really resisted it and got in the way. But he didn't see himself that way. And the laughter that happened around the table in that moment, and the stories that they kind of got off track, and I had to pull them back in, but I think it really impacted people's relationships by him being vulnerable and sharing. So 4 questions. What went well? What was a challenge? What will we do differently? And what did we learn? That is just so important in any change process. I really encourage you to use this. I've used it even when I change the way I do business. Really, really valuable. And then the other piece I want to mention, for those of you that were in the breakout session with me, you'll remember we talked about the working styles, the HAL Stacks working styles. I love this resource. I use it all the time. So it's probably familiar. It's going to sound familiar because it feels like it has elements of DISC and some of those amazing other inventories and assessment tools. The difference is this one has nothing to do with personality. So it's not a personality indicator. It's about working styles, the way in which people work and the values that they attach. So let me give you an example. HAL Stacks says there are 4 working styles: the driver, the expressive, the amiable, and the analytical. And when I do the tool with people in their workplaces and training and change processes, a lot of times people will actually be tied. They have 2 really predominant styles. My styles are a driver. I really like to get things done. I love results, love crossing things off my to-do list. The other style that I'm equally tied on is an expressive. big picture thinker. Sometimes it takes me a while to get to the point. I communicate through stories, and my husband would tell you that. He's actually sitting in the other room listening, so I'm sure he's nodding his head. The amiable is all about relationships. They're your peacekeepers. They're the people on the team that they notice I love this quality about them. They notice the innuendos, the very subtle shifts that people experience, where somebody just might be not in line with what's going on in the organization. So they're the relationship people. They really value relationships. They value trust, peace, and harmony. Your expressives value creativity, innovation, solving everyday problems with new solutions. Sometimes when they're in conflict, they don't even know. People have to say, we're in conflict, because they so enjoy the richness of the diversity of perspectives that happen in disagreement. They're not sort of personally attached to it. And then the drivers are about results, about focus. They're kind of the vision keepers in an organization. They're the ones that have that business plan, and they're really focused on goals. They're also not comfortable with conflict, sort of like the amiables, because you have to talk about the backstories, and they don't like the backstories. They just want to get to the point and solve the problem and move on. And it can be uncomfortable for them to deal with emotions. And then the other working style is the analytical working style. These guys are so skilled. This working style is so skilled at working on process and finishing from A to Z. They are very methodical in how they work, and they ask a lot of questions. Now let me say, the questions actually drive the drivers crazy. The drivers will say, why are you asking me all these questions? Why can't you just get down to it and do it? And the analyticals, what I love about this working style is they ask the questions that are critical for success. So in change management, an analytical working style will be very likely to ask questions that can actually help you with the change management process and communication. They're very detail focused. All four of these working styles are critical in an organization, and they're all exceptional. If you were all in the same room with me right now, this is where I would get you to do one of those turn to your neighbor and repeat after me things, and I would get you to say, all four working styles are great and really important. Here's the key. This is the #1 thing that can actually change how much stress you have in your life and how you cope with change and how you expand your field of vision. Here's the key. You want to grab a pen and paper for this. If you can learn to be all four styles, and if you can learn to show up more like the other person's style, you'll reduce tension, you'll more quickly get to solutions, you'll be able to bring people over to a new way of thinking with less resistance, and you'll actually strengthen relationships and trust. So here's let me just give you an example. And I'm going to share an example of my husband, and he knows I talk about it. He's listening right now in the other room. I'm sure if he disagrees with me, he'll come out of his office and say something. So Christopher is, and you'll remember him from the sailboat story. Christopher is very high in analytical thinking. He worked in geomatics and engineering. He was a land surveyor for many years. He's very process-driven, very methodical, and just wants the information that he needs. So this is the common hand gesture that I get from Chris if I'm explaining a new idea. Sort of the get to the point. He's also a driver. So he's tied as an analytical and a driver. He likes to get things done quickly. He likes to get from A to Z. He's not overly comfortable with all the conversation that has to go into solving problems or disagreements. He just wants to get to the solution, not sort of work through the emotions of it. Now, I'm a driver. Can you see where we might clash already? I'm a driver, and I'm also an expressive. So I'm working on big picture things where sometimes I might need to be more focused, or sometimes I'm working on a big picture thing and Chris might need to be more expansive in his thinking and expand his field of vision. Now, Chris was at a workshop actually once when I was speaking, and I was talking about the working styles with this particular company, and Chris sort of had an aha moment. He got it. He said, oh my gosh, you know, if I show up more like Charmaine, our conversation might go better. So he actually showed up in a conversation, not as an analytical working style, but more as an expressive driver. So he asked me questions. And, you know, he said, well, what about this? He got involved in the big picture thinking. And our conversation, actually what happened is I started to communicate more like him. So here's the deal. Here's the rub. When in life, whether it's about change or just every day at the office, if you're going to deal with someone whose working style is different than your own, if you're an analytical working style and you're going to deal with someone who is an amiable style, they're going to want to know how your weekend was and how your kid's soccer game was, and you might not even be interested in that conversation. But to make that dialogue go between the amiable working style and the analytical, you might simply start off by saying, hey, how was your weekend? And they might kind of look at you like, what? He never says this, or she never says this. And of course, you're going to be genuinely interested. You're not faking it. And then you might ask another question. See, what happens is amiables really value a place of trust and comfort. So if you were to just come in and say, I'm going to talk to you about this and I need an answer by 2, they're probably going to retreat back and they're going to start worrying. Did I offend them? Did I do something to upset them? I wonder what's going on. So if you show up more like the other person's working style, you can advance conversation, build trust, get to the heart of the issue quicker, and resolve issues faster. And in change processes, this can really, really work well. When I go in to deal with, so I am not an analytical working style. I would love to be, because that's where I have bumps in my life. When I'm working on projects, my thinking sometimes is on a really high level, and I'm excited to get it done because I'm a driver as well. But it's all the steps involved that I kind of go, now this is really hard work. And that's why I bring in analyticals into my team, because they are skilled where I have deficits. When you put together a change management team, you want to make sure that you have all 4 working styles: the driver, the expressive, the analytical, and the amiable, because they're going to be able to appeal to people who are just like them, who have the same working style. And they're going to be thinking of things that you never thought of. So a big picture thinker is not thinking about all the details. They're just thinking, let's roll out the change, and we've kind of got the plan, but they're not thinking about when will this happen, who's going to say it, who will write it. That's where those drivers and analytical working styles come in really, really handy, right? They have a skill set there. And then your amiable working style is going to say, wow, how should we manage people's relationships around this change? What kind of support do we need to give them? They're thinking about the people, how they're going to cope. Do they need additional support? How can we stay in touch with them verbally and on a relationship level? So the working styles is so valuable to keep in mind when you are talking about change. They're actually, I use this every day of my life. I'll give you an example on a personal level. I was going in, this is years ago when I was a mediator, and I was actually more of an amiable back then. I wasn't an expressive, I was an amiable driver, and really not so high on the driving. And I went in to get we had a Blazer at the time, and I went in to get it picked up. We had some car repairs done, and I think it was supposed to cost, let's say, $90. And when I picked it up, it was like $500. Now, the amiable side of me just wanted to, work it through and have a dialogue. And then this driver's side thought, wow, this is a problem. How did we get from $90 to $500? What happened? But the amiable side of me, who wanted to have a relationship and not offend somebody, and I don't like conflict. Interesting, I was a mediator. So really good at dealing with other people's conflict. But in my own, I would be uncomfortable. And so that's when I had to sort of, in my internal dialogue, say to myself, okay, Charmaine, you need to be more like a driver and an analytical right now. So you need to ask the questions that an analytical working style would ask. How did we get here? Why is it $500? Who did you approve that change through? Help me understand what happened here. That's the analytical working style. And then I need to be a driver. Let's figure out a solution to this. I'm not comfortable with the $500 bill for work I didn't authorize. But see, the amiable in me kept taking over, that I wanted to be nice and I wanted to not offend them. And then the driver in my head said, Charmaine, you don't have to have an ongoing relationship with this person. You can take the Blazer anywhere to get repaired. And once I understood that my value as an amiable was about relationship, but in this case, I didn't need to have a relationship with them. Didn't mean I had to be rude or harsh. It just meant the relationship really wasn't important right now. So I could put that aside. That day in the car dealership when I got my car repaired was hugely transformational for me. It also helped me become far more comfortable with conflict that I would have in my own life. I could see it differently. So the key to all of this is to show up more like other people's working styles, not just your own, because the more you try and push your style, it's just like that push back. If you're trying to be a driver or an analytical or an amiable, expressive, whatever your style is, and you keep pushing your style on them, what do? They push back with theirs. We also want to get help from people that are different from us. They're the best people to help us through change, challenge, expanding our field of vision. So get help from people who are different from us, not always like us, because if they're like us, they're going to already tell us the answers that we would have already thought of. So invite help from people whose working style is different. We've covered a lot of ground today. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm getting some comments. Thank you. Some great insights. You're welcome, Chris, and I'm glad that answered your question. Here's the deal. I'll be sending you some resources over the next couple of days. You'll have it by Tuesday that talk about what we talked about today. So just some notes that you can use. You're welcome to share this webinar or parts of it within your team. I would like to make the commitment to all of you that if you have questions that come up, or let's say you're back in the workplace and you're using this working style of information, or you're working on cascading messages, or you're using the review and learn and you forgot one of the questions, please just email me. My email is charmaine@charmainehammond.com, and I know you got that on the notes from the conference where we were together. Email me. I'd be happy to answer your questions, and who knows, I might even have some additional resources that I could send your way. So let's stay in touch. Let's make sure that we're connected on LinkedIn. I really hope that you'll put one of these tools into practice. And again, big shout out and appreciation for the organizers of the conference. Great event. I was delighted to be a part of it and to have met you all. And thanks for joining us. I'm Charmaine Hammond. Take care.